Hello, I'm Jean-Michel Grosjeu and we are back for the 9th time with all of you Space Empires lovers. And when I say Space Empires, I mean the complete works, the basic box and its 3 expansions, Close Encounters, Replicators and the latest All Good Things. Today there's one dimension left that we haven't explored yet, and still this dimension is one of the most important in the conquest of Space Empires. Today we are going down to the ground and see how in this game you fight when you have both feet in the dust. What happens when 2 enemy powers, units of different colors, are in the same hexagon that also contains a planet? First, there may be ships like the ones we've seen in the last 8 videos, but if there are only ships, it's a space combat as we already know, and the planet doesn't change anything. So let's add some other units. First, the planet may simply belong to one of the 2 players. Let's say, for example, that yellow player has a colony on the planet. On his colony, he has a shipyard that is there to produce units, but also has some combat capabilities. I put it in low orbit, not really on the planet's surface, and not in space either, because that's exactly the status of this unit. It has the same combat capabilities as a ship, but it is attached to the planet and cannot leave its hexagon. There are other units of the same kind, such as the base, for example. Okay, but this is still a space combat. All these units are going to fight up in the air, and at some point, if red player wants to take over the planet, he's going to have to land on it and plant his flag. That's why he must bring units to the ground, marines for example, and heavy infantry. But of course, these soldiers cannot fly on their own, so he needs a transport ship to transport them. And finally, yellow player has also been able to deploy ground units to defend his colony, not to mention the civilian population, who can also take up arms in the form of a militia to defend their homes and families. And that's what a real planetary combat looks like, with new units that have their own objectives and abilities, which is what we'll be talking about throughout this video number 9. So let's start with the simplest case. We'll remove everyone and keep only the essentials. A red ship attacks a yellow colony and that's it. Yellow player has been very careless and has no protection. In this case, planetary combat is reduced to its purest form, bombardment. Simple, each attacking ship gets 1 shot at the colony. There is no fleet size bonus. Let's assume that red player has brought 3 destroyers. He has 3 shots, 3 die rolls. The colony has a defense of 0 and no defense technology. We assume that the red destroyer is equipped with level 1 attack technology, so each shot is successful on a roll of 1 to 5. The red destroyers inflict 2 damages. Now, the target colony must absorb these damages, and in order to do that, you must simply remember its development cycle and reverse it. So here, with the first damage, the colony returns to the previous stage where it was only producing 3 CPs. On the board, add a grey token with the value of 3 to remember that the planet is still controlled by yellow player. Then the second damage brings it back another step to a 1 CP colony. And that's it, we'll stop there for this example. The red fleet bombed the planet and seriously damaged the yellow colony. But it's still standing and the planet still belongs to the yellow empire. Note that if we were in the 3rd turn of a cycle, an economic phase would come next, and at the end of this economic phase, all the colonies would advance 1 level, including this yellow colony that repairs 1 level of damage. Let's assume that everything remains as it is and we move on to the next turn. Red player can bomb again, 1 shot per ship per turn. Same thing, let's assume that red player hits twice. The first hit reduces the colony to 1 CP, and the second hit eliminates it. The yellow colony no longer exists, the planet is no longer part of the yellow empire. But beware, it's not part of the red empire yet. Destroying this colony doesn't give red player any rights on it. The only way to colonize a planet is to bring a colony ship. So later, red player can bring in a colony ship and start the colonization process again, one step per economic phase. And finally, we can conclude from all this that a colony in itself has 3 hit points. It takes 3 successful shots to destroy it. And if it had been a player's home planet instead of a colony, each successful shot would have reduced it by 5 CPs, and it would have been whipped off the map with 4 successful shots. And finally, one last special case, if a red fleet attacks a planet on which yellow player has just landed a colony ship, so technically it's already a yellow colony but it doesn't produce anything, well, in that case, a single successful shot is enough to destroy the colony. Okay, you've got the basics, that is the reason why players engage in planetary combat, because in the end, the only thing that matters is who will control the planet. Now, let's take a slightly more realistic example. Yellow player has 2 cruisers to defend his planet, and he has 3 shipyards on the ground, with which he built these 2 cruisers, but which also have combat capabilities and can help repel the red player's attack. And of course, red player cannot just bomb and destroy the yellow colony. He must first deal with the defenders in the air, the cruisers, and in low orbit, the shipyards. The balance of power is no longer in red player's favor, so for the sake of this example, let's give him a little boost by assuming he has brought 4 dreadnoughts. That's indeed more impressive. It's red player's turn, he has finished his moves. We go on to the combat phase, it's a standard battle. Let's assume that no one has special technology or experience, no fleet bonuses. Red player could put 2 ships in screening, but is not here to twiddle his thumbs, so no, everyone attacks. Class A, the dreadnoughts attack the cruisers, 3 damages, so 1 cruiser is eliminated and the other gets 1 damage token. Class C, the cruiser hits and eliminates 1 destroyer. 2 shipyards also fire and hit. Bad news for red player, he has no destroyers left. The last shipyard fires at the dreadnoughts and misses. Attack 3 against defense 3, he would have hit only with the result of 1. Dreadnoughts are really tough opponents. At this point, both players have completed the first round of space combat, but as you know, they must keep firing until one side is completely wiped out, either eliminated or retreating to an adjacent hexagon. And so, we go on. Class A, the dreadnoughts, well, I'll make it short. All 4 shots hit and all yellow units are eliminated. Fine, because now we are back to the previous case. It's bombardment time and each attacking ship is allowed 1 shot and only 1 against the colony. Let's assume that the dreadnoughts succeed in inflicting 3 damages and eliminate the colony. As we said just before, this removes the yellow player's control over the planet, but does not establish the red player's control. He must bring in a colony ship and start the colonization process all over again. Voila! Space combat, bombardment, you get the idea. Now let's take it up to the next level. Because okay, it's one solution to come with dreadnoughts and destroy everything, but isn't it smarter not to destroy the enemy colony so you can use its infrastructure and set up your own colony there without having to start the whole process over again? Of course, it's possible, but for that, you need ground troops. You need soldiers to land on the planet and seize the infrastructure you want to capture. Here are ground troops, 3 infantry troops. you can see that it looks exactly like a ship with a class, attack strength, defense strength, and hit points. But the big difference is that it cannot fly and move in space. A ground troop can only survive on its own if it's on a planet. And if it wants to go somewhere else, the only way is to be transported by a transport ship. The transport ship, just like the infantry unit, can be produced from the beginning of the game by a shipyard without the need of any special technology. And its primary job is to transport ground units. One transport unit can carry 6 ground units. It's like carrier ships with fighters. It doesn't matter who is transporting whom. What matters is that the 1:6 ratio is maintained. So, for example here, 11 ground units for 2 transport ships is fine. The soldiers are being transported and they can survive in space. And as with the carrier ships, if a transport ship is eliminated, ground troops must be eliminated to comply with the 1:6 ratio. Needless to say, it's generally best to protect your transport ships with screening to avoid disaster, because an eliminated transport ship means the destruction of its entire cargo. In space combat, the transported ground units cannot do anything, and their lives depend on what happens to the transport ship. Note that the backs of ground units are the same as for the ships, so your enemy is unable to guess that this force is in fact a landing group heading straight to invade his precious planet. A transport ship cannot explore, so it cannot enter an unexplored hexagon on its own, and a transport ship cannot be captured by a boarding ship if it is carrying troops. In other words, it can be captured, but only if it is empty. Okay, now let's see how it works in combat. Remember, your goal is to capture the enemy colony instead of destroying it. So, how do we do that? This red assault fleet enters a yellow colony hexagon protected by we don't know who until the battle begins. Combat phase, all units are revealed. On the red side, a transport ship filled with 6 infantry troops and 4 dreadnoughts to escort the assault. On the yellow side, defending 2 destroyers and 3 shipyards. And then, as always, we start with space combat. Until the space combat is over, nothing happens on the ground. There are 5 combat units on each side. Infantry doesn't count in space combat, of course, so no screening. Here we go, Class A. The dreadnoughts blow up the destroyers plus a shipyard. Then Class C, where red player suddenly realizes he's been careless because the 2 shipyards can easily target his transport ship. It only has 1 hit point, so 1 successful shot can destroy it, along with the 6 infantry troops inside. Its defense is 1. We'll see what the second value means later. Luckily, yellow player misses his die rolls, but it's a lesson to remember. When you send transport ships into battle, you must have enough ships to hide them with screening, where they won't be at risk. Class D, nothing happens because transported infantry doesn't take part in space combat. Class E, the transport ship can fire but it doesn't hit. A transport ship really isn't meant for fighting. And there you have it. Round 1 is over, but the combat is not over. There are still fighting ships on both sides. So we start again with the second round, and as expected, the dreadnoughts blow the remaining shipyards away. This time, the space combat is over. And we move on to the next step, bombardment. But this time, since red player has brought in troops, he has no desire to damage the colony he wants to capture, so he declares that he will not bomb. Bombardment is never mandatory. And next step, he lands his troops on the planet. And that's when the civilians living in the yellow colony take their guns out of their closets and bravely climb the ramparts to defend their homes. These civic spirits take the form of a militia token with a numeral value of 1 for each CP produced by the colony. So here a 5 token. Note that you only count the production of the colony itself. If there had been an industrial center on the planet, the militia would still be size 5, not 10. And the militia would also be size 5 if it were a research center instead of an industrial center. So even if the colony produces RPs, it generates the same quantity of militia. In other words, in this game, scientists are as good at fighting as workers. However, note that a home planet that produces 20 CPs gets a size 20 militia. So the day you want to invade your neighbor's home planet, remember to bring with you a very large army. Or bomb it, because remember, each point of damage reduces the planet's production by 1 step, and so it reduces the number of militia you'll find there when you land. Back to our example. The Red Infantry has just landed, the local militia has lined up in front of them. Now it's time to resolve the ground combat. As its name suggests, this is the phase during which ground units fight, so air units are no longer taken into account. The rule is simple, a unit either fights during space combat or during ground combat, never both. So ground combat plays out exactly like space combat with the same rules. Here we have 6 Class D units with an attack of 5 and a defense of 1 against 5 Class E units with an attack of 5 and a defense of 0. All units on both sides have 1 hit point each. But first thing to know, units that have just landed on the planet cannot attack in the first round. It takes time to gather squadrons and prepare equipment. So here, we skip Class D and go straight to Militia Class E. Attack 5, Defense 1. There are never any modifiers for ground combat. No attack or defense technology, no tactics technology, no fleet size bonus, and of course no retreat. All units are trapped on the planet's surface with no way to leave. However, screening is possible. With a 6 unit against 5, red player could put 1 unit in screening, but in this case it wouldn't make any sense. So we roll the dice. The militia eliminates 2 attackers. Then we move on to round 2, Class D, Class E, and so on until the end of battle. As in space combat, we go on until only one side remains. At the end of the combat, there are 2 possible cases. First, the defender yellow player wins. He eliminates all the attackers. Obviously, the planet remains under the control of yellow player. The only thing to note is that the militia disappears. The militiamen return to their civilian lives. That's why the token is black and doesn't match the color of any of the players. It is not meant to remain on the game board. If another enemy force attacks the planet later, the same militia will appear back at full strength, 5 here, the number of CP produced by the planet. Losses are not recorded, they are fully repaired between each attacks on the planet. Second case, if the attacker, red player, wins the battle. His men have taken control of the planet and captured the colony. This costs him 1 point of ground unit, which he must discard. That means that some troops must leave the army to take care of the colony and run the facilities. Here, red player has only infantry, so he discards 1 infantry unit. Even if it is its last infantry unit, it doesn't matter. He must discard it to take possession of the colony. He puts his own colony token on top of the yellow colony. And from now on, this colony belongs to Red Empire. Starting with the next economic phase, it will produce 3 CPs for red player. 3 CPs because combat and the change in administration always reduce industrial efficiency. A captured colony always loses 1 step in the process. Also, it does not produce RPs because as soon as a colony is captured, all facilities are eliminated. So, if red player wants to produce RPs again, he must build one of his own research centers. Note that if the attacker captures a brand new colony that only produces one CP, he downgrades it to a colony ship. This means that his new colony does not produce any CP, but anyway, it does save him from bringing one of his colony ships back from the other side of the galaxy. And in the next economic phase, his new colony will start producing one CP again. Finally, if the attacker lands troops against an enemy colony ship, so a proto-colony that produces nothing at all, and therefore does not even have militia to protect it, he replaces that colony ship with one of his own, which still saves him a lot of time. And voila, in this example, at the end of combat phase, red player did conquer the planet and controls both the ground with his new colony and infantry troops, and the sky with his 4 dreadnoughts and an empty transport ship. Now, yellow player would like to get his planet back, but with 4 red dreadnoughts defending it, the task won't be easy. Don't worry, as we'll see in a moment, there are always solutions. It's yellow player's turn, and he moves a new fleet into the hexagon. He's not afraid. In the combat phase, he reveals his forces. So, the main element of his assault is a transport ship with 5 Marines units on board. Marines, as you can see, are ground troops but stronger than basic infantry. To build them, you need to master ground combat technology at level 2. Marines have 2 classes and 2 attack strength because they depend on whether they are attacking or defending. C6 if attacking, D5 if defending. There is another type of ground unit that can be produced with level 2 ground combat technology, heavy infantry HI. It is pretty much the exact opposite of Marines, D4 if attacking, C6 if defending, with a defense value of 2 in any cases. So clearly this is the ultimate defensive ground unit. Okay, here, yellow player is making an assault and had therefore produced 5 Marines loaded into a transport ship. Then he added a fleet to protect his assault. Let's see what plan he has in mind. It's time for space combat, and right away red player must decide what to do with his ground troops, because he has a transport ship in the hexagon, so his 3 infantry units can be on the ground or in the transport ship. Both options are possible. So he must decide right at the beginning of the battle, and after that he cannot change his mind. He decides to leave them on the ground to defend his colony. Round 1. A space combat always starts with the screening question. Red player has 5 ships, yellow player has 11. We don't count the Marines inside the transport ship because they do not participate in space combat. Yellow player can protect up to 6 ships with screening. He chooses to protect only his transport ship. This is obviously a very good idea, otherwise red player would target the transport ship until it is destroyed along with the Marines inside, ruining any chance of a yellow invasion. The unscreened yellow fleet is still twice as large and benefits from the fleet size bonus. So, Class A, the dreadnoughts target the destroyers. Their goal is to reduce the number of yellow units enough to prevent them from screening their transport ship. Without any special technology, the dreadnoughts eliminate 3 destroyers. Next, classes D and E. The scouts and destroyers face a near impossible task. Against dreadnoughts with a defense of 3, they need to roll a 1 or at best a 2. Let's assume they get no results. And the same for the red transport ship. Let's move on to round 2. With 8 ships against 5, yellow player has lost his fleet size bonus, but he can still protect his transport ship by screening, and that's the main thing. Class A, I'm not showing the die rolls, but it's still the same slaughter, 1 destroyer and 2 scouts down. Then we get to Class E. The red carrier fires and misses, the yellow scouts decide to retreat. They don't fire and run away. End of the second round, and this is what yellow player was planning, because after 2 rounds of space combat, both players can choose to land troops on the planet. So, yellow player can declare that he is landing his marines, even from a transport ship that was screened, and that was precisely yellow player's plan to protect his transport ship with light units, even if it meant they would be slaughtered, but to hold out for 2 rounds so he could land his troops and attack on the ground. Now, this is still step 1, the space combat is not over, so right after the marines land, the red dreadnoughts can fire on the yellow transport ship and easily destroy it. But it doesn't matter anymore because it has completed its mission, it has landed its troops on the planet. After 3 rounds, the space battle is over. In the air, in space, there are only red units left. Next step, bombing. Since it's yellow player's turns, only yellow player can do bombardment, but he has no ships left in the hexagon, so he cannot. However, even if he had a ship, he wouldn't have been able to bomb because you cannot bomb if you have friendly troops on the ground. Another important point to understand is that bombardment is a special attack carried out only against a colony. Bombardment attack never targets ground units such as infantry or marines. And next comes the troop landing phase. Again, in fact, it's important to understand that the 2 opportunities to land troops correspond to 2 different strategies, and often it's either one or the other. In the first case, which we saw earlier with red player, the attack fleet wins the space battle, and once he has won and cleared the area of all enemy ships, it can freely bomb the colony. Then, eventually, it lands its troops and attacks on the ground. The second case is the yellow player's technique in our example. He fights 2 rounds of space combat but doesn't win. He holds out just long enough to land troops on the planet, but then, even if he wins the space combat, he cannot do a bombardment attack because his friendly troops are on the ground. Note that in both cases, militia is generated just before ground combat, even if there are combat troops on the ground. Red player gets 3 militia units because his colony produces 3 CPs. And so step 4 is the ground combat with yellow marines against red infantry plus militia. I'm not rolling the dice to make it simple. If in the end yellow player recovers his colony by force, eliminating all the infantry and militia, he spends 1 marines unit to take control of the city, the colony becomes yellow again, but we keep the red token to show that it has been red at one point in its history. We'll see why we do this in a moment. And the colony loses 1 step in the process. So, what's interesting is that we end up with a blockade situation where the fleet controlling the hexagon, the red fleet, does not belong to the same player as the one controlling the planet, yellow player. And if we think about it, there are 4 possible outcomes to such a battle. Let's take the case of a yellow colony, the defender, being attacked by the red player. First case, the yellow defender repels the red attacker in space combat. The hexagon remains under yellow control, as does the colony. Second case, the red attacker wins the space combat but does not win the ground combat and does not capture the yellow colony. In this case, there is a blockade. The colony is still yellow, but red player controls the airspace above the planet. Third case, the attacker has time to land troops on the ground before losing the space combat, but he wins on the ground and takes control of the colony. The result is a blockade, but in reverse. And finally, the last case is complete victory. Red player wins the space combat, then lands and takes control of the colony. So, in 2 cases, there is a blockade situation. The player who controls the colony is not the same as the player who controls the hexagon. In my little diagram, red player controls the hexagon, This means that red players' fleets can freely pass through the hexagon. However, another player's fleet, even yellow players, must stop and fight. In general, remember that it is fleets that block movement, not ground units. A colony with as many ground units as you want does not block enemy fleets' movement. However, if you add anything that can fight in space combat, such as a shipyard, then stop, no one can pass. And if you look at the yellow colony under Blockade, first it produces nothing, no CP, no RP, no LP and no TP, and it cannot produce new units with or without a shipyard. It cannot build facilities, and if a mining ship has brought minerals or a space wreck to it, the minerals or wreck remain there and cannot be converted into CP or technology as long as the blockade exists. The colony and units under blockade remain there under lockdown, waiting for the blockade to be lifted. However, the colony upgrades as usual. If it has been damaged and is at step 1, even under blockade, it will automatically return to step 3 and then 5. And before moving on, I want to make things as clear as possible. If a player wins a ground battle, he captures the colony but destroys everything else attached to the planet, shipyards, bases, and so on. And this includes minerals and space wrecks. The only thing that can be captured is the colony itself. And finally, if a bombardment destroys a colony, it destroys all units on the ground. So you cannot bomb units on the ground directly, but you bomb the colony, which one destroyed eliminates the units on the ground, which finally makes no difference. So there you have it. There's no point in shielding a planet with tons of ground units if there isn't a minimum of space units protection to prevent bombardment. And of course, bombardment also destroys facilities. And I'm not even mentioning shipyards and bases, because if you eliminate the colony with bombardment, it means you've won the space combat, which also means there are no shipyards or bases anymore. Otherwise, the space combat wouldn't be over. It's a bit of mental gymnastics, but I'm sure you're getting used to it. One last thing before we move on. Ground units are not completely powerless against bombardment. They have a minimum of anti-aircraft weapons. The game calls these planetary defense. For bombardment's die rolls, the colony has a defense of 1 if it is protected by 1 to 3 friendly ground units, and defense 2 if there are 4 or more units, but militia doesn't count, only ground units bearing the player's color. Now it's time for a wrap-up. Infantry is the basic unit that can be built with level 1 ground combat technology. This is the level all players start with at the beginning of the game. And with level 2 ground combat technology, you can build heavy infantry or marines. These are the next level up in defensive or offensive versions. All these units are governed by the same construction rules. On a given planet, you can build a number of ground units equal to the CP production. So, on a standard colony with 5 CPs, you can build 5 ground units, 5 per economic phase. And then, from economic phase to economic phase, you can store as many ground units as you want. There is no limit to the number of ground units, only to their production per economic phase. And there is no need for a shipyard. You can build ground units anywhere on any colony. Not to mention, of course, militia, which you don't need to build because they just pop up when your colony is attacked. You can upgrade to level 3 ground combat technology. This allows you to build grav armor. These are powerful ground units, class C, attack 6 and defense 2, but they also serve as support for other units. At the beginning of each ground combat round, each player counts their grav armor units. The player with the most can support a number of his units equal to the difference in grav armor between the two players. Support means a bonus of +1 attack and +1 defense. So if I have 3 grav armor units and my opponent has only 1, the difference is 2 and I can choose 2 of my ground units that will benefit from +1 attack and +1 defense. Ground combat technology at level 3 also gives the drop ability, which corresponds to airborne operations. This allows units that are landed on a planet during an invasion to fight immediately, whereas a standard unit cannot fight on the first round. Finally, note that with this level 3 ground combat technology, the defense of transport ships increases to 2. That's why there were 2 different values on the token. Now look at what happens after a colony is captured. Well, when your troop captures an enemy colony, your soldiers will search the drawers and discover your opponent's secrets. When you capture another player's colony, first, it costs you 1 infantry, they are the people who will administer the colony. Then 2, the colony loses 1 step. Then 3, you put your marker on top of the old one to show that the colony is now yours, but without forgetting who it belonged to before. And why do we keep the memory of the player who controlled the colony before? Well, simply because some civilian populations belonging to that player remains on the planet, and so for simple ethical reasons, the previous owner can no longer bomb that planet. They would risk hurting their own people. I know history shows that some countries have no such concerns, but Space Empires is a gentleman's game, so we don't do that. So, in our example, even though the colony now belongs to red player, since it belonged to yellow player earlier in the game, yellow player cannot bomb that planet anymore. His only option to regain control of the colony is to land troops, and it's quite possible that after several hours of play, a colony will carry the memory of 2 or 3 players and no one will have the right to bomb it. That being said, let's go back to the basic case. A red player has just captured a yellow colony, and by taking possession of the place, they inevitably discover valuable information about the yellow civilization. First, yellow player must show to red player his Empire card. We'll see what this card is in video number 10, but in a nutshell, it represents the advantages of the player's faction. Is it a race of insectoids or giants? When red player's troops capture the colony, they quickly understand whether they are dealing with insectoids or giants. Note that yellow player shows his Empire card to red player, but not to the other players, only the player who captured his colony. Next, yellow player also shows all the alien technology cards he's earned through contact with alien civilization, as seen in video number 7. For example, if yellow player knows about the polytitanium alloy technology, which allows them to build their destroyers for 2 CPs less, he must tell red player, and only red player, only the player who captured the colony, has access to this information. And since red player will be searching through the archives and hard drives, yellow player must also simply show him his production sheet. This is a record of everything he's done since the beginning of the game, with all of his empire's technological knowledge listed at the bottom of the sheet. Be careful though, because yellow player doesn't show his ship technology sheet, so he doesn't show the exact composition of his fleets or the tech level of each individual ship. But he does show an overall picture of his technological progress. And then, red player can use this information to increase 2 of his own technologies by 1 level for 2 technologies where yellow player is more advanced than him. Note that if the planet is in deep space, it's a somewhat remote and provincial colony, then the winning player can only advance in 1 technology instead of 2. And there is no technology gain when a player captures a planet that was previously his own. So, in our example, there is no technology gain if yellow player later captures his planet back. Fine, and now that we know the basics of ground combat and planetary conquest, as usual, let's go into detail and look at some special cases. First, we know that we can buy ground units, especially to protect the planets we colonize, but ground units are expensive, especially when multiplied by the number of planets to defend. So, as a gift, the game gives us free infantry units. Think of it as the military mobilization of your planet's citizens. The more colonies you have, the more you can mobilize. In each economic phase, you get one free infantry unit for every 3 fully developed colonies that produce 5 CPs. Colonies under development with 1 or 3 CPs are not counted. Players' home planets are not counted either. In this example, there are 4 colonies divided by 3 rounded down, that makes 1 free infantry unit, which the player can place wherever he wants on any fully developed colony, a 5 CPs colony, or on his own planet, with a maximum of 1 new infantry unit per colony. If you earn multiple free units, you must distribute them 1 per colony. These free units are basic infantry, but from level 2 ground combat technology, you can choose heavy infantry or marines instead, but nothing else. No grav armor units, for example, even with ground combat level 3. And now let's talk about low orbit units. The most famous example is the shipyard. The shipyard is the unit that builds spaceships, but if its planet is under attack, it's also a unit that can fight. During a planetary battle, the shipyard fights in space combat, so for example, an attacker cannot bomb the planet as long as there is a shipyard to defend it, because as long as the shipyard is not eliminated, space combat is not over. Okay, but still, you don't buy shipyards to defend planet. It's not a very powerful combat unit. It's not designed for that. If you want to defend your planet, build a base instead. Like a shipyard, a base is attached to a planet and stays there. It cannot move. You need level 2 ship-size technology to build bases, and you don't need a shipyard. You can build bases on any colony. Beware, when I say bases, I should say a base, because there can be only 1 base on a given planet. The numeral token underneath is always a 1. Since it cannot move, it benefits from all technologies without having to go back to a shipyard, and it doesn't need to pay for maintenance. So, what makes this unit so interesting is its class A, its 7 attack points, 2 defense points, and 3 hit points. For 12 CPs to build, you won't find anything better. It's a shame you can only build 1 per planet. And then there are the DSNs, Defense Satellite Network, a network of small satellites that defend your planet. I won't go into too much detail because a DSN works exactly like a base. It's the same unit, but costs half as much to produce, 6 CPs instead of 12, and is slightly weaker. Like a base, you can only build 1 per planet, but that means you can have both a base and a DSN. And that's it for the units I call low orbit. There will be a 4th one in the next video, number 10, but one thing at a time. For now, I'd like to say a few words about the transport ship. As we've seen, its job is to transport ground troops. There are 6 slots in its cargo, so you can put, for example, 3 infantry units, 2 marines, and 1 grav armor unit. Okay, but if you remember the previous video, number 8, you know that it can also transport logistic groups to supply units far from their colonies. Here, 3 logistic groups that represent 15 LPs. And well, guess what? There's a 3rd thing you can store in a transport ship. Fighters. A fighter takes up one slot, but that doesn't mean the transport ship can be used as a carrier. No, because the big difference is that a fighter aboard a transport ship cannot fight. It's like an infantry unit. The fighter is aboard the transport ship, it does not fight, and if the transport ship is destroyed, the fighters it contains are also destroyed. So, in our example, we end up with a perfectly valid situation of two transport ships carrying a mix of ground units, logistic groups, and fighters. As usual, there is no need to specify which element is in which transport ship. For example, if a transport ship is eliminated in combat or because of a black hole, the player chooses which elements to eliminate so that only 6 elements remain at the end. Let's take another example. This transport ship moves into a hexagon that also contains a yellow carrier with 6 fighters plus some enemy dreadnoughts. There is a space combat. What's new here is that you must set aside the 2 fighters that are in the transport ship's cargo. We saw in the previous video that if there are several carrier ships in a hexagon, it doesn't matter which carrier is transporting which fighters, but with a transport ship, it's not the same. For example, suppose the dreadnoughts attack and eliminate 3 fighters. Well, when it's yellow player's turn, he cannot say, I'm attacking with 3 plus 2 equals 5 fighters because the carrier can easily support those 5 fighters. No, he cannot say that because the 2 fighters in the transport ship's cargo are not participating in the battle at all. And if later on the last 3 fighters on the carrier are eliminated, the red dreadnoughts can target the carrier directly even if there are still fighters in the hexagon. The fighters do not protect the carrier because they are inside the transport ship's cargo. And now let's tackle the last special case, alien planets. We already know that when we talk about aliens, we are talking about barren planets. So everything we saw with the landing of troops and ground combat against a barren planet only works if you have terraforming technology at level 1. Without this technology, you won't be able to land on a barren planet, let alone colonize it. Then, what we saw in video number 7 was the general case. You discover a planet in deep space, you draw a planet attribute token and you get its air defense, the number on the left, which in this case is 5 ships. Then you have no choice. There's a space combat, and in any case, from that point on, as long as a player hasn't destroyed the entire alien fleet, it stays there and defends its planet. Okay, now let's assume the problem is solved, the alien fleet is gone, the space combat is over. So now the attacking player must make a choice. His first option is to do nothing else, bring in a colony ship and quietly colonize the barren planet. Note that any player can do this, not necessarily the one who fought the alien air defense. Now that the planet has no defense anymore, it becomes an empty planet like any others. And once the planet is colonized, the player wins its reward. I mean the alien technology card. And note, this may seem surprising, that this way of colonizing a barren planet is possible even if the planet attribute token shows some alien militia on the ground to defend it. This planet of abundance has a small 2 indicating 2 heavy militias. But that doesn't matter. If the player eliminates the 5 alien ships in space combat, he still has the option of not landing, ignoring heavy militia, and colonizing peacefully with the colony ship. But then, after that, the colony ship will upgrade into a colony of 1 CP, then 3, then 5, and that will take 9 turns. So if the player is in a hurry, he can try to go faster by invading the planet. Invading an alien planet means landing ground troops and try to capture the alien colony, because in this case, it's as if there were a colony on the planet, but a colony that belongs to no one. Please don't look for this 5 CP's gray colony token. It doesn't exist in your Space Empires box. It's just to illustrate my example. So, first of all, we are after the space combat. Unlike a battle against another player, you cannot land troops on the ground after the second round of combat. No, against aliens, you must finish the space combat first, then you can land. And then, when the space combat is over, there is no possibility of bombing either. No bombardment against aliens. So, you go straight to the landing. And there, as in a standard ground combat, you start by placing the defender's militia. As we just said, imagine a virtual colony with 5 CPs, so that makes 5 militias to defend it. Plus, the heavy militia shown by the planet attribute token. In our example, 2 heavy militias. And that's the army you'll have to defeat to capture that alien colony. And note that even with a 0 on the planet attribute token, you'll still fight 5 standard militia units. Let's assume that a player lands his troops and defeats the alien forces on the ground. Then, he captures the colony by reducing it by 1 level. It goes from 5 CPs to 3 CPs, but compared to the previous solution, this saves him a lot of time. No need to bring a colony ship or restart the colonization process from the beginning. And when it comes to gaining alien technologies, both techniques gives exactly the same reward. As soon as the player has a colony on the alien planet, whether he captured it through invasion or rebuilt it with a colony ship, in both cases, he gains an alien technology card, which he chooses from 2 randomly drawn cards. And that's it. It's pretty similar to invading another player's colony. The difference is that you cannot land during space combat or bomb the colony. And there's another very important difference. Invasion, landing troops on the ground, is only possible immediately after a space combat victory. This means that if you win the space combat by eliminating all the alien ships, but you decide that you don't have enough ground forces to fight the alien militias, then if you go back even on the next turn, you can no longer land and fight on the ground. Your only choice then is to colonize with a colony ship. I know it's a little weird, but that's how the aliens work. And voila! With this last screen, I wrap up my 9th video about the complete rule set of Space Empires. There will be one more video, the last one, in which we'll cover everything else. That is the extra chrome, the last layer of fantasy. I will also include lots of optional rules, additional scenarios, and what you need to play with 6 players or more with alternative empires and replicators. Now, I let you get a good night's sleep. I hope you won't have too many nightmares. And I see you very soon right here chez Jean-Michel Grosjeu.